In the second half of Section 7, let's look at some examples of weed interference with other plants in terms of competition allelopathy, parasitism, and indirect interference. The early illustrations published by Pavlichenko back in 1937 still provide one of the best visual pictures of competition that goes on above ground and below ground, especially with root systems, as shown here comparing the wheat with the wild mustard. Again, I'd point out that above ground it doesn't look like there's a whole lot going on in terms of competition, maybe a tiny bit of shading, but that's about it. Certainly no competition for space yet. Below ground is a different story, and these two different root systems are even touching and overlapping at some points. So they're definitely competing at this point for water, nutrients, and certainly for space. Competition is relatively easy to see in the field as long as you have a side-by-side comparison where there's no competition versus weed competition on the other side. And you can see here that it's having an effect on the corn under heavy competition. This is a picture I showed earlier, but it illustrates the fact that even controlling weeds when they're fairly small doesn't mean that they haven't already taken a toll on the crop in terms of competition. That's illustrated in this photograph where the grasses have been sprayed and controlled, but they've already reduced corn growth and vigor significantly. So this brings up the question, how early do you have to control weeds in order to avoid these competition effects on the crop? Well, that's an excellent question that I'll answer in the next section. This just shows some intense competition between water hemp and soybean to the point where you can't really see any soybeans in there. You see the competitive effects of common ragweed on corn. In this picture, the corn plants the leaves are starting to roll up because of drought stress. And probably some nutrient stress as well. Well, this picture is meant to show allelopathy. English ivy that a lot of people like to plant in home landscapes and around border areas. It's allelopathic, and you can see that it reduces the growth of weeds that are within proximity of its root system. So this just shows how it kind of uses these chemicals as a way to reduce competition from neighboring plants. Now, it's not uncommon to find a lot of allelopathic plants in nutrient-poor or high-stress soils like these sands in central Florida. These plants that grow in these little islands out here are highly allelopathic, and you can see how they've cleared out a border around themselves using allelochemicals as a way to fend off neighboring plants and reduce their germination and growth. Pine trees are allelopathic. Sorghum species produce a chemical called sorgoleone, which is an allelochemical that's produced when the sorghum decays. So in soil systems, sometimes sorghum species are used as a cover crop, but we have to be careful because some plants that are planted into that residue may suffer the effects of that sorgoleone, as shown with this tomato plant here that was planted too soon into the crop residue of a sorghum species. Well, here are some examples of parasitism. Remember, this is when a plant lives off the resources of another and contributes nothing to the host's survival. So one case in point are some of the tree parasites like mistletoe that live in trees and sink feeding organs into the tree's outer covering to get to the nutrients and water inside. This is an example of an important parasitic weed of agriculture around the world called dodder. The genus is Cuscuta. There are many different species. Dodder does exist in Ohio and in the Midwest here. And all you're going to see, or most of what you see here on the dodder plant, are its stems. It has no leaves really to speak of, just residual leaves, but it's mostly stem. It doesn't contain chlorophyll, and the reason why it doesn't have leaves or chlorophyll is it doesn't need to carry on photosynthesis because it gets all of its nutrients from the host plant. So daughter, when it finds a suitable host plant, it will sink in these little structures here, these little tooth-like structures. Those are called haustoria. Now, you may have heard that term before because it's basically just a parasitic feeding organ, but it's a term that's used to describe the parasitic feeding organs of some fungal pathogens and other things as well. That haustorium secretes enzymes which help dissolve the outer covering of the plant, stem or leaf or whatever it's infecting, and then it works its way inside and finds the conductive elements, the phloem and xylem of the vascular tissue, where it just sucks out the nutrients and water like it's sucking it out through a straw. This micrograph shows daughter in action. This is the daughter plant here on the left. This is the haustorium here that's infected the alfalfa stem. The alfalfa stem here, you see the xylem and phloem here, and that's what the haustorium is after, because that's where the sugars and all the water and inorganic nutrients are flowing. Another important parasitic weed worldwide is called broom rape, or Orobanche. Again, there are several different species of this around the world. These infect the root system, and about the only time you're going to see any portion of the shoot is when it flowers here. It sends up a flower stalk and produces rather large flowers so it can reproduce by seeds. In this photo, we see a resistant variety that was developed in Israel for resistance to broom rape compared to the susceptible variety on the right. Well, a third parasitic weed of worldwide importance is witchweed, or striga. Again, several species of that. Witchweed parasitizes crop roots as well, but you can see it's not an obligate parasite. It also produces green leaves and can carry on some photosynthesis. When it flowers, it makes these nice bright red flowers, and a single plant is capable of producing over 1 million seeds. But it does take a heavy toll on the crop through this parasitic action. It's a big problem in subsistence farms in Africa, and they spend a lot of time hand weeding just to try to get the witchweed to a reduced population in order to make some corn. These micrographs kind of show in sequence how the witchweed plant works. When it germinates from seeds in close proximity to a host root, it will immediately start sending in haustoria and insert feeding tubes, shown here, inside the phloem cells of the host plant. Well, that brings us to our fourth type of interference that I call indirect sources of interference, when weeds harbor pests or pathogens that can be harmful to our plants of interest. One of these is a obligate winter annual that we've hit on a time or two before in the lectures, and that's purple dead nettle. Turns out that it's an alternate host of the worst soybean pathogen economically, called soybean cyst nematode. This nematode is able to complete its life cycle not only on soybean, but it turns out a number of weedy species, and a particularly good host is purple dead nettle. Now, I pointed out earlier that purple dead nettle is a very common winter annual in Ohio and throughout the Midwest. It particularly likes to colonize no-till cornfields. One of the reasons why it does well in that environment is because it's really not bothered. It tends to come up and get established after the corn's been harvested, and it completes its life cycle before the next spring when crops are normally planted. So because of that, it's been largely ignored as a weed because it's not competing directly with a crop in the field at any particular time. So people just tend to ignore it. But little did they know that it may be serving as a host for their worst nightmare if they're soybean producers. Soybean cyst nematode causes more economic damage to soybeans than any other pathogen around the world. This is what the juvenile stage of soybean cyst nematode looks like. You know it's a pathogen, a plant pathogen, because it's got that stylet there. It's like a little needle that it injects into the host roots to suck out nutrients. The female, once she starts feeding, she never moves from that spot, and her body becomes a leather-like cyst. When she dies full of eggs. Anywhere from 100 to 400 eggs may be inside that little cyst. And that cyst is strong enough and resilient enough to keep the eggs alive inside for a number of years before the next host plant comes nearby. These are some cysts where I've ruptured those with a dissecting needle just to show you the eggs inside. All those little oblong structures are eggs. Again, a single cyst can contain up to 400 or so eggs. So we've tried to get the word out that it's important to control alternate host of these pathogens to reduce their incidence in the crop. It's important not to ignore purple dead nettle as just this little obscure winter annual weed that's not really hurting anything, when in fact it could be adding to the reproductive load of soybean cyst nematode in a lot of our agricultural fields.